very pleased now to have Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska joining us, and he just told me that he is backing that permitting plan.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, Dan, I think you were the one who once pointed out that, what was it, the runway for Seattle?
Yeah.
22 years?
Yeah, this is a hearing we had on permitting reform in the Commerce Committee. The head of the SeaTac airport was talking about how long it took them to build a new runway. I asked him the question. I asked him how long it took him to get the permits to build the new runway at the SeaTac airport. 15 years. And then I said, how long did it take you to build the runway? He said, about 4 years. And then he looked at me and said, Senator Sullivan, I believe the Egyptians built the ancient pyramids in a quicker amount of time than. So Joe Manchin I'm one of his partners on permitting reform. It's critical to the country, critical to every state, and Joe's been a great leader on it.
Yeah. So, Dan, we're going to talk about actually foreign policy and national security before we turn to energy. And you're just back from the Munich Security Conference, which is the CERA security, I guess I would say, the CERA week of security conferences. And you had some very strong takeaways, messages.
Well, you know, it was a really important conference. I co-led a Senate delegation of 12 Republican and Democrat senators to this annual Munich Security Conference, meet with a lot of the world leaders there. Of course, there's a lot of focus on our national security supplemental that had just passed the Senate, and we can talk about that, Dan.
Yeah.
But one area that it hasn't made a lot of, didn't make a lot of press, every ally that we spoke to had major concerns about the Biden administration's LNG moratorium. I mean, the most senior German officials, EU officials, everybody. And what they were saying was essentially this: hey, we are working on getting, all of us, weapons to the Ukrainians, lethal aid, helping them in terms of intel. But the United States has been getting another really important weapon and element of American strength and power, which is American energy to our allies. And now that's not going to happen. So this issue came up in every single meeting. And, you know, I know the secretary was talking about today at lunch, Dan. You had the deputy secretary of energy testify on this a couple weeks ago saying, hey, don't worry, our allies are fine with the pause. Our allies are not fine with the pause. Our allies in Asia, our allies in Europe, and this is a huge, in my view, geostrategic mistake. A number of senators have written Mr. Podesta today saying you need to lift the pause. One of the things that's happened is you may have seen the day after they announced it, the Qataris announced a huge expansion of their LNG operations, what they're looking at, possibly being able to have 25% of the global market. Russia immediately reached out to the Germans saying, hey, we can provide you energy. That's exactly what we don't want to have happen. And yet that pause is driving our allies into the arms of countries that, in my view, they should be depending on all of you, all of us. American energy is American power. And to me, that was a huge takeaway from the conference that didn't get a lot of press, but it was a huge deal. And the discussions right now among the administration, by the way, my colleagues, my Democrat Senate colleagues, all have huge concerns about this. So this is a very big strategic blunder, in my view, made for domestic political reasons, and we need to get it lifted.
So on the other big issue, of course, was Ukraine and what you call the supplemental.
Yeah.
Why don't you talk about the status of that bill and the degree of the support, what Ukraine needs, and how that bill works? And
so this is what different people have called it, given it different titles, the Ukraine military aid bill. I actually am referring to it what it actually is. And it's actually a bill to enhance the industrial capacity of the United States to produce weapons. That's what the bill's about. That's why I voted for it. So, and one of the big reasons when you look at kind of where we are right now, Dan, in terms of this new era of authoritarian aggression, you have the dictators in Russia, in China, in Iran, in North Korea, all working very closely together. And the way we tried to shape this bill was to be strategic in our response, but it's also an attempt to make up for what the Biden administration has done in its first 3 years. Every budget President Biden puts forward during this very dangerous time, he's cut defense spending and readiness. And then we have our own industrial base that has really atrophied in the ability for our country to produce weapons for ourselves. So what this bill does, about 60% of this bill, of over $60 billion, goes directly into the industrial base of America to produce everything from nuclear subs to 155 millimeter howitzer rounds and every weapon system in between, which we need for our own defense. I mean, you talk about nuclear subs, that's the one weapon system that we still have a huge asymmetrical advantage over China on, that Xi Jinping is very nervous about. And so as we are trying to now move this in the House, to me, it's important that we have the ability to produce weapons for our own defense and then get some of those weapons to our allies who are facing existential threats. And that's Ukraine, that's Israel, of course, and that's Taiwan. So to me, that's the better way of framing it, and I do think we have good prospects in the House, but that's the more accurate approach than calling it a Ukraine aid bill. It's a lot more than that.
Why is it not understood?
You know, it's a great question, because I think this benefits everybody. I was on a conference call with a bunch of senators, Republicans and Democrat senators, just yesterday. Everybody who supported it, I've talked to the Biden administration, National Security Advisor, his team, saying framing matters, right? If you call it just the Ukraine bill, and people don't understand what's actually in it, and they don't understand our inability to produce weapons for ourselves in these very dangerous times. I'll just give you one example. About 40% of the U.S. attack submarine fleet is not in the water because we're behind on maintenance. 40% of our subfleet. This is the kind of bill that helps rebuild that industrial base to build and do maintenance on weapon systems as important as submarines. And I think we all just need to do a better job of explaining it.
So, at least from what we read in the media, I mean, you just said prospects are good in the House. I mean,
well, I'm always an optimist.
Okay. Do you know something that most people don't know?
No, I mean, look, every time the speaker has come over to talk to Republican senators, he has talked about the importance of making sure, A, we have the industrial base to protect ourselves, but B, making sure authoritarian aggressors like Putin can't win when they invade and, kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians. And, one of the things that you've heard from some of my colleagues, well, look, we're not going to be focused on Ukraine, we're not going to help them, but we'll be really strong against China in the Taiwan Strait, for example. And my answer on that is, deterrence is not divisible. You can't say, hey, we're going to be really strong here, but we're not going to be strong over here. The world doesn't work that way. And one of the ways we know that that's the truth is just look what happened after the Afghanistan withdrawal, the botched Afghanistan withdrawal. A lot of us, myself included, predicted, hey, after that, watch out, there is going to be a whole host of authoritarian regimes pressing. And they did, and we saw that. I don't think you would have had the Ukraine invasion by Russia if it weren't for that botched Afghanistan withdrawal. So all of these issues are connected. These dictators are working together, and that's why we need a bill that is comprehensive, that tries to address a number of things, and that's what this bill is done. It's not perfect. The House can improve it a lot, but when the speaker's talked about these issues to Republican senators, he's been quite strong.
So we'll pivot to energy in just a moment, but one last question. We're in an election year, presidential election year. What impact do you think that has on foreign policy?
Well, look, I think it's having an impact. I think every election year has an impact. I think in terms of Republicans, what I've been talking a lot about, whether it's Republican Senate or House candidates, is just remember our legacy. We're the party of peace through strength. We're the party that has focused, whether it's Reagan, whether it's Trump, the first term of the Trump administration, we rebuilt our military, we built readiness after a very, very significant cuts to our military and readiness during the Obama administration. That's the legacy, the George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Eisenhower, Teddy Roosevelt. That's our legacy. And, the whole idea of American retreat from the world, just read a little history. That typically doesn't work out so well. So we need to continue to be that party of peace through strength. It's a dangerous world, and it doesn't get any safer by cutting defense spending, by retreating. And, one of our great strengths in terms of American power is represented right here, American energy. And I think that's why what you're doing, Dan, and what CERA Week represents is so important, not just for our domestic economy, but for the strength of our nation.
Right. Well, let's pivot now to another, from that subject, which is energy, and talk about energy, particularly in this state of Alaska. How does it look?
Well, I think it's even in some of your materials. The North Slope of Alaska has once again become one of the hottest basins in the whole world. It's certainly, I think, the hottest basin in America. We have some great explorers right here in this room who are doing great work. If you look at the Willow project that Conoco's doing, that's close to about a $10 billion investment. They have 1,800 workers on the North Slope right now this winter, building out that project. We have another project called the Pitka project, which is another multi-billion-dollar investment. These two combined will peak production will probably get close to 300,000 barrels a day. We got great explorers like Bill Armstrong right here doing great exploration work. So Alaska has once again become a really, really hot prospect. It's near existing infrastructure that's 2/3 empty, the great Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and our Alaska LNG project also from a geostrategic standpoint. I think the time is now. So for all the investors in the room, come on up to Alaska. It's the prospects have never been stronger, and there's a lot of great companies already there.
Do you ever have any clash with with Washington about regulation?
Let's just say I'm not necessarily on John Podesta's Christmas card list. Yes, the answer is yes. And to be honest, it's a struggle. You might remember a year ago during CERA Week, you and I talked about the Willow project. That was a project that had been approved by the Trump administration. And to President Biden's credit, they reapproved it. And it took a lot of hard work. But there's a whole host of areas that I think when you look at what they're doing on a whole host of areas in terms of federal lands, it kind of goes against when they come here and talk, right? They say they're for all above energy. I think they have their hands on the scales against hydrocarbons in a whole host of areas. But this is what our state, our country need. It's what our economy needs. By the way, we do it better than anybody in the entire world in terms of our environmental standards, the highest standards in the world. And in Alaska, it's, as you know, Dan, it's not just oil and gas, all kinds of energy prospects and enormous critical mineral prospects.
Right. Is that going forward?
This has been part of the challenge.
It's been a big theme of the conference, critical minerals.
Yeah, so we have, again, for the people familiar with Alaska, enormous storehouses of critical minerals. And I would say, particularly in this area, the Biden administration has not been helpful. They've canceled some projects, they've canceled some roads, and it's a little bit ironic. You get John Podesta, Secretary Granholm up here talking about the need for critical minerals, the transition. I heard John Podesta just say the net zero is dictated by science. I don't believe that, but I'll tell you what net zero is not dictated by. It's not dictated by the law. There's nothing in U.S. law that says 2050 net zero, 2035, nothing. So this is another area where The challenges are significant, but when they talk about the need for critical minerals and things, then they start looking at Canada, they start looking at Australia, and we're like, no, 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 no. Look right here.
Right.
Look at America. Look at Alaska.
So let me ask you a really simple-minded question. I've heard you refer to the federal government as the landlord of Alaska.
It is.
So the federal government owns about 2/3 of Alaska. Why is that? I mean, I'm sorry to ask a really simple question. How did that happen?
Well, this is long-standing, many laws over the years. The big one was in 1980 called the Alaska National Lands Interest Act, what we call ANILCA. And this is kind of federalized about 66% of our land there. But we have some really important, very recent Supreme Court cases on this law that are telling the federal government, hey, there's a whole bunch of things in this law that make it very important for the economic development of Alaska. And you, federal agencies, have to abide by this. So, like in a whole host of areas, I know Joe Manchin was talking about the West Virginia versus EPA ruling, this Chevron ruling that might be coming up. There's a whole host of things happening in our federal courts that are paring back the power of these agencies that, from my perspective, make it harder to develop our resources, harder to develop a strong economy, not just in Alaska, but nationally. And I think there's kind of a real counter movement legally that's going to be helpful, but it's a long story how we got there, and trust me, we fight the feds every day up in Alaska.
Because you were Attorney General.
I was.
Yeah, so you know this stuff very well.
I spent a lot of time suing the Obama administration when I was Attorney General, but that's a whole nother story.
That's right. So, but on critical minerals, do you see the development going ahead?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's so important, and you heard the Secretary talk about it today. It's just that we need a national policy that is coherent. You can't have, I'll just give you one example. We had a road to a huge, really important critical mineral area called the Ambler Mining District in Alaska. Did a 7-year EIS.
A DIS.
Environmental Impact Statement. Approved, started during the Obama administration, approved during the Trump administration. The White House and the Biden administration holds a big critical minerals summit on how important this is for America, the same day that the Department of Interior reversed the Trump administration EIS for the critical mineral project in Alaska and said start over. So this is the kind of incoherent policy that's coming out of this White House that makes it more difficult to develop American energy, develop critical minerals. And again, I think like everybody in this room, I am all of the above. Oil, gas, wind, solar. But you can't pick favorites. And I remember last year, John Podesta was talking about permitting reform. I couldn't agree more. We need it. But his permitting reform was just for renewables. Well, that's not how it works. We need it for everything. And that's why we need a coherent strategy and policy that, you know, I think everybody in this room would agree with.
Right. So, and to pick up from where we were before, do you think there's a pretty good shot at permitting reform this year?
Well, look, I will tell you, Joe Manchin, you just heard him. He's a great senator, a good friend of mine. He and I are going to actually go do a little press together after this event. He's done a fantastic job pushing on this. And this is one of these issues. You talk to any mayor in America, you talk to any governor in America, doesn't matter what party, they know that it's killing us that it takes 9 years to permit a bridge. I mean, we had a gold mine in Alaska. It's now up and operating. 400 people working on it in Southeast Alaska. It's called the Kensington Mine. Average wage is about $110 per worker. Really good wages. It took 20 years to permit this mine. And the only way we got it done was a Supreme Court case that we won in the U.S. Supreme Court. None of that helps America.
Yeah.
And whether it's a renewable project, a critical minerals project, an oil and gas project, it's imperative that we get it done. And I do think there's a political will. I know Joe he's really put his shoulder into it, but it just makes sense. The only groups that in my view, don't want permitting reform done are the groups that game the system. As Joe was talking about, you can have groups, we've all seen it all over the country. There's a permit that's approved, and 5 years after its approval, they'll sue on it. Well, there shouldn't be a 5-year timeline,
yeah.
right? There's a whole bunch of ways in which we can tighten up our permitting system that makes our country stronger and all of our resource development projects, but not just that, roads, bridges, ports that we need. So I'm going to keep pressing it as long as I'm in the U.S. Senate.
Well, Senator Dan Sullivan, please join me in thanking him.
Thank
for
you,
joining
Dan.
us this afternoon.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.